Hi, I'm Peter Beinart. I'm a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York and a senior political writer for the Daily Beast.
And I am Christopher Preble, and I am just the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. I don't have nearly as many titles as Peter does.
That's probably better for you. That's probably better for you. Well, we're talking about Afghanistan and maybe some associated stuff. So, Chris, do you want to get started?
Sure, absolutely. I think we're recording this at a time when the whole country, or at least those of us who focus on these issues, is anxiously awaiting the president's decision on whether to send more troops to Afghanistan. My colleagues have been working on this issue much more than I, although I've become more involved and interested in it over the last few months. And basically, I've come to the conclusion that the reasons we went into Afghanistan at the outset initially were perfectly good ones. That was to degrade al-Qaeda's ability to pull off another 9/11, to send a message, and to drive the Taliban from power. Those are the two most important things. And the third was to send a message to any other group or country or nation state like the Taliban that says if you were to do these kinds of things in the future, that would be a really bad decision on your part. And my take is that we achieved most or all of those objectives in the first few months of the intervention in Afghanistan. And so I think it's kind of incumbent upon those who want to double down, essentially, on the commitment in Afghanistan now, 8 years after the fact, to explain what exactly we've been doing over the last 8 years and what it would have looked like, or what it would look like if we returned to basically where we were in January or February of 2002. And, I don't make this lightly, and it's not a process that's going to happen overnight. Obviously, we have upwards of nearly 70,000 troops in Afghanistan, even if no more U.S. troops are sent, and over 100,000 if you count the rest of the NATO contingents. And it's going to take some time to transition security responsibilities. But the bottom line is I think the United States, in particular, has to narrow our objectives and refocus on the few core things that should guide our mission there, and not get wrapped around the axle on a lot of other kind of subsidiary and tertiary missions that are, I think, frankly, next to impossible to achieve.
And what do you see as those? Just so I understand your perspective better,
Sure.
What do you see as those few core missions that we should be focusing on?
Well, something else that I've written quite a bit along with my colleague Justin Logan is the notion that the United States has to fix failed states in order to be reasonably secure from terrorism. And I think Afghanistan is case number one, and perhaps test case number N for whether or not that's true. I'm extremely skeptical, in fact, that about this argument that we have to fix failed states. And even if it were true, fixing failed states, a state as failed and as weak as Afghanistan, would be a truly monumental undertaking. And I think even people who admit that it will be difficult and take a long time aren't being honest enough with themselves, let alone with the American people, on just how difficult it would be and just how long it would take. I think there is a much better way, a more kind of narrowly focused on the mission of, again, degrading al-Qaeda's capability, ideally in a perfect world, capturing bin Laden, Zawahiri, and Mullah Muhammad Omar. I mean, those are the three key figures we'd like to have in our clutches or something. Beyond that, it's hard for me to see how raising up Afghanistan in the near to medium term, from where it is on the list of state failure to a slightly less failed place, would demonstrably improve our own security. And that's the gist of my critique. Again, not just of the war in Afghanistan, but more generally of using U.S. military power to try to repair weak and failing states.
Yeah, well, I think there's reason to be cautious about an overly broad claim that all failed states lead to terrorism or any other form of national security threat that I think that poses a grave threat to the U.S. And I think, but I think if one is going to look for failing states that have posed a threat to the United States,
of course,
Afghanistan and the tribal areas of Pakistan are not a bad place to look, since that is where 9/11 came from. And it does seem that most of the terrorist plots that seem to be coming, that we seem to be learning about, do seem to have some connection, often someone from the West some connection to those places in Pakistan.
Correct.
I guess what interested me about what you said was that it sounded like you were saying that one of our core objectives in going to war after 9/11 in Afghanistan had been to topple the Taliban. That had been a necessary thing to do. So
Right.
it sounds to me that the implication would be then that were we to allow the Taliban to come back into power, that would be that keeping the Taliban from power is a core goal of the U.S. Or are you suggesting that it was toppling them was a core goal at one point, but allowing them to come back would not necessarily be something worth fighting against today?
Not necessarily, and not necessarily if fighting to keep them from taking control were likely to play out the way the General McChrystal strategy is likely to do, which is in excess of 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan for an indefinite period of time. I mean, they're very careful not to define how long that will be. They talk generally about when the American public's patience will wear out, which is not very long, but my argument is the American public's patience is already worn out. No, I think that the Taliban, first of all, we've even lost a sense of who the Taliban is, and we've lumped together a lot of organizations that are not technically part of the movement that Mullah Muhammad Ammar and his small collection of student followers and whatnot. Nor is it clear to me, and I think others who have studied this more closely than I, it's not clear to me that a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, one, is inevitable in the event of a U.S. drawdown. I don't think it is inevitable. As is noted many times, the Taliban, of course, are extraordinarily unpopular in Afghanistan, still unpopular, despite all that's happened over the last 8 years. More to the point, if some remnant of that Taliban movement were to retake control of part or even all of Afghanistan, it's not obvious to me that they would give al-Qaeda aid and comfort in the same way they did in the late 1990s. We know of considerable tension between al-Qaeda and the Taliban, especially after the African embassy bombings in 1998, where essentially the al-Qaeda had violated a tacit deal they had with the Taliban not to engage in those kinds of activities, not to attract undue attention to their safe havens. We also know of stories of the Taliban in negotiations with Turkey al-Faisal and the Saudis to try to engineer some kind of handover of bin Laden and the rest of them back to the Saudis. So, even in a period that we perceive as a kind of golden age of al-Qaeda and Taliban working together, there was considerable tension. And I think, given what has happened to the Taliban since 9/11, and again being driven from power and having to fight their way back to some control in a few pockets of Afghanistan over the last 8 years, that it's not obvious to me that they would choose to go back to where they were prior to 9/11 and essentially ensure the United States continuing to harass them. And when I say harass, the U.S. military's ability to harass anyone is really quite enormous. Harassment is not a few rounds fired here from here and there. It's B-52s dropping bombs from 30,000 feet. That's the kind of thing they'd have to deal with if they were to make that decision in the future. Again, to give aid and comfort to al-Qaeda.
Yeah, I mean there are a couple of concerns I have with that point of view, which I feel even the Obama administration has been emphasizing the distinction between the Taliban and al-Qaeda more recently than in the past, and more than the Bush administration did. And in some ways, you can understand the idea that they do that the Taliban itself. The Taliban, as you say, is a broad word that encompasses lots of different people who may be fighting for different reasons, and yet. Right. There is this disturbing suggestion that my colleague at New America, Peter Bergen, made, which I think it seems to have been what David Rode, who had a very intimate experience with the Taliban in captivity, a horrific and intimate experience, which is actually that in some ways that the trajectory has been actually the reverse. That
they're becoming closer, right?
That they're becoming closer for a variety of reasons, and so I think it would be foolish to suggest that anyone could know and predict, and yet it seems to me it's kind of an interesting parallel with often the debates that Americans tended to have about the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War, which is to say, to what degree are we dealing with a truly ideological movement, and to what degree are we dealing with movements that are basically are nationalistic or tribal and are just using ideology as a veneer. But it's certainly, I think it would be easier for the United States in many ways were we to conclude that in fact these are basically just a bunch of Pashtuns who don't like being tread upon by a foreign occupier, who were being paid off, who are upset because someone shot their cousin, and in some ways, if left to their own devices, might have their own problems with Al-Qaeda, just like the Sunni tribesmen in Iraq did. I mean, that would, it seems to me, be the best. That would be good for American security were that true. Right. And yet it seems to me that it seems to me, if anything, the people who seem to be bringing the best evidence to bear, at least that I've seen recently, and I speak to you like someone who's not an Afghanistan expert, seems to be suggesting disturbingly that in fact something else may have happened, that there may have been a more genuine merger of these two groups marrying into, Zawahiri marrying into local families, and the Taliban. The Taliban were, although a local Afghan movement, a genuinely, deeply ideological and I think frighteningly totalitarian movement. I mean, they were not just a group of traditionalist conservative Pashtuns. When they blew up those Buddhist statues and made Hindus put yellow markings on their doors and yellow markings on their clothes when they walked around after 9/11, this was a genuinely frightening kind of emergence of a kind of totalitarianism that seemed to me grew up for whatever reasons in these Pakistani madrasas. So that's one set of concerns, it seems to me, that people making your argument need to try to deal with.
And absolutely, and I certainly agree with that. It's a concern that we need to take into account. I think, for starters, you've already alluded to it. The Taliban are chiefly Pashtun, but they are certainly not all Pashtun or Taliban, far from it. And the question is, what is going on in the broader Pashtun community, a community, of course, that spans both Afghanistan and Pakistan? What are the fissures in that movement? What do they expect from their fellow Pashtun Karzai? I mean, what is it? Why is it that Hamid Karzai only has a certain degree of legitimacy? To what extent is the United States' strong support of him undermining that limited legitimacy? Why is it that a Taliban movement that is dictatorial, tyrannical, and in some respects out of step with a considerable portion of Afghan society, even the Pashtun society, why is it that they're able to claw their way back in a few pockets around the country? Clearly, violence and intimidation is a key factor there. And so, I say we should go back to where we were in October of 2001 and remember that it was not U.S. military power chiefly that drove the Taliban from power. It was the Northern Alliance working with a very small number of U.S. forces and then, over time, some air support. And those same kinds of tribal tensions and conflict are what would make life very difficult for the Taliban in the future, if, for example, U.S. military power was slowly withdrawn. And I think it's also been alluded to the fact we're not dealing with an insurgency here, an insurgency against Karzai or an insurgency against the foreign military presence, but it is a civil war in Afghanistan that has been going on for some time. In what ways does our treating the Taliban movement as a broader Pashtun movement and treating them as a transnational ideological movement, in what ways does that exploit or exacerbate this civil war, and are we on the right side, or even in the right trajectory of being on the right side? It's not clear to me we are. I think there's just not a lot of long-term strategic thinking about what's likely to happen. This is ultimately what it comes down to. I'm a historian, so I'm forced to speculate on the future all the time. The question is, what is likely to happen if the United States does what General McChrystal requests, which is send 40,000 or more troops and stays there for 10 or more years? What is likely to happen, or what it is likely to look like 10 years from now, or vice versa? What is it likely to look like if we draw down over an 18 to 24-month period and look like 10 years from now? And I think if you factor in the costs of staying as opposed to the risks of leaving with a residual force and training for the Afghans, I think that's a much better place to be 10 years from now, but still not a pleasant place, by any stretch. There are no good options. That's said all the time, but I think that's certainly the case in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ironies, it seems to me, about the debate about Afghanistan is that people who've looked at it tend to start with the assumption that the Taliban is an unpopular enemy. I think that, I think it is one way in which this is really quite different than Vietnam, for instance. That in Vietnam, for various reasons, the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, the North basically took over Vietnamese nationalism, and basically had a lot of prestige, being the people who fought the French and fought the Japanese. But it seems to me this story can be you can take this fact in one or two ways. It seems to me what you're doing is basically saying, since the Taliban are not that popular, it's probably unlikely they're going to be able to take over Afghanistan again. That there are natural limits, perhaps, to the degree of power, kind of territory they're going to be able to take, and therefore, perhaps to the degree of a threat they're going to be. On the other hand, it seems to me that this is also perhaps the single most important fact that one can take for those who believe that there's a chance of success there. That in fact, basically, we're dealing with a group of people who, if if Afghans, including many Pashtun Afghans, were offered anything like a better alternative by the Afghan government, that they would take it in a heartbeat. And that it seems to me one of the important things for me as I try to think about U.S. policy going forward is to have an accurate understanding of what U.S. policy has been in the past. And it does not seem to me that what we have seen over the past 8 years is the failure of a U.S. nation-building effort in Afghanistan. It seems to me what we've seen is the failure of a non-U.S. nation-building effort in Afghanistan. That what's, it's frankly, I recently had reason to go back and read Douglas Feith's book and also Richard Haas's book. And what comes through very clearly in both those books is the degree of pessimism, the deep pessimism and fatalism in the Bush administration from the very beginning about Afghanistan as a nation-building enterprise. The deep desire, we forget that Bush didn't want to be a nation-builder because he ended up having to be a nation-builder in Iraq. But he never had to become a nation-builder in Afghanistan. He didn't want to be a nation-builder. The U.S. refused to participate in that peacekeeping force. We were going to basically run around. The strategy of going after al-Qaeda and not the Taliban was really, in many ways, the Bush administration's strategy. And I was struck by the degree to which that was firmly in place even before we started moving resources from Afghanistan to Iraq. So it seems to me that for those people who say our presence on the ground in Afghanistan has been very light. It's gotten bigger, but it's still been extremely small compared to Vietnam and Iraq. And so it seems to me that if one is looking at what worries me in a way is the sense that what the Biden position is really, in many ways, a continuation of the kind of the Rumsfeld position. And it has been basically this position that has allowed, first of all, that has allowed the Taliban to take more and more control, even despite their lack of popularity. And it's perhaps sent a message to Pakistan that we're not really making a serious commitment there. And then finally, simply as a moral proposition, I find the prospect of the U.S. essentially ceding more and more ground to the Taliban, even if we can prevent them from taking Kabul, let's say, and increasing airstrikes, to be a kind of moral dystopia. What does that mean for the average Afghan? It means basically the Taliban on the ground, and we know that the U.S. air power is much worse for civilians in terms of killing innocent civilians than U.S. people on the ground, even though it's better for us in terms of our loss of life. And I think, obviously our primary moral obligations are to our own citizens. But we do, it seems to me, have some moral obligation to Afghans as well. And it seems to me, I shudder when I think about the moral horror that essentially is a Taliban movement taking more and more of Afghanistan and the U.S. basically blowing up villages from the air.
Right. And I don't want to imply that the striking from 30,000 feet is by any stretch a perfect solution, because it's not. And there are many not just moral but also practical problems with using that approach to deal with terrorism. But I go back ultimately to, you've already conceded, the rationale for going into Afghanistan after 9/11 was not chiefly about the moral crimes of the Taliban, which we were well aware of back in 1999 and 2000, but because they had harbored a clear and present danger to the United States, al-Qaeda. And that is the rationale that is driving policy, or at least it is the public rationale that's driving policy. Now, if you wanted to go to the American people and say, look, the national security rationales for this are actually quite limited, or at least there's some ambiguity around the national security rationales. There are compelling arguments on the for or against a long-term, heavy presence in Afghanistan, 100,000 plus boots on the ground. But instead, this is chiefly a moral question. I would be happy to entertain that discussion, but that's not the discussion that we've been having over the last 8 years. And again, go back to Iraq. I mean, this is relevant also to Iraq. What did the Bush administration use as its central rationale for going into Iraq? It was not the moral consideration. It was not that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator and had done horrible things to his people. That was one of the rationales. But the rationale that sold the war to the American people was that he was in possession of weapons of mass destruction and that he was going to give them to al-Qaeda, his buddies.
Yes.
Once those two rationales were shown to be completely false, then the moral component just was not sufficient to sustain an American presence, and it still isn't, because, of course, Saddam's dead and there are no weapons, and the moral component of what's happening in Iraq, an incipient civil war, and a civil war that's likely to grow worse as U.S. forces are drawn down, I believe that is going to happen, and yet that moral challenge is not sufficient to sustain public support. I think exactly the same thing is going to happen, is already happening in Afghanistan. The American people say, look, relative to the costs of this mission, we will not sustain this over a 10, 15, or 20-year period, which is what, we can talk about nation building. I already alluded to this. I mean, I've written on this quite a bit. When we are honest about the likelihood of success, most nation-building missions fail, a majority, more than 50%. In fact, the first RAND study they did on this said 2 out of 7 were unadulterated successes, Germany and Japan, and the other 5 were ambiguous or failures. And that's a RAND study, okay? Since then, we've looked at other nation-building missions. What do we know about them? They are extraordinarily costly, they take a very, very long time, and still a majority of them are not unadulterated successes or even counted as a success. What does that say? What does it say about Afghanistan? One other point, and it's closely related. We need to talk about cost and we need to talk about opportunity costs. Sending more troops to Afghanistan means diverting money and resources and attention to a particular mission in a particular place that those resources might be dedicated elsewhere. If you look just at the surge, an additional 40,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, that essentially is equivalent to the annual budget of the Department of Homeland Security. DHS's budget is just under $43 billion. An additional 40,000 troops roughly comes out to about $40 billion a year. And I think those kinds of calculations are very useful in debating the wisdom of staying in Afghanistan or doubling down in Afghanistan relative to the alternatives.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. An honest debate has to be a debate in which you look at opportunity costs. You look where you would spend the money in elsewhere. I'm not necessarily on the U.S. public opinion. It seems to me U.S. public opinion, at least is what I've seen, is basically shows that the country is pretty much at a 50-50 split right now. And remember, the debate right now is between sending more troops and keeping the number of troops where we have. Obama's not even talking about the idea of withdrawing troops. So I think I think people have been. I think what people do in this, when talking about public opinion, is essentially they're extrapolating into the future based on the idea that American public opinion is going to continue to decline. Support for Afghanistan is going to continue to decline because it has clearly declined from where it was a while back. But it seems to me we have not really reached that tipping point yet. What we've reached now is you can still find robust percentages of the American people who want to go along with McChrystal, and then you can find a bunch more who want to stay where we are, and you could probably find some, if you gave them the question, who would want to start to draw down.
Right. But it's about a third is what I've seen. About a third is in favor of an increase, a third is staying the same, and about a third wants withdrawal.
And it seems to me that the lesson of Iraq, one way in which one can usefully talk about lessons in Iraq, and obviously there are many ways in which the surge in Iraq the lessons do not apply, is in fact what it says about U.S. public opinion, which is that what seemed like an inevitable trend downward in terms of U.S. public opinion on the support for the Iraq War did stabilize and tick back up because people felt like we were having more success there. So I do not believe, particularly given the degree of bipartisan goodwill there was about the Afghan mission to begin with. It doesn't seem to me, if you believe that with more troops we can have more success in Afghanistan, and I start from the view that basically the effort we've been making in Afghanistan has been genuinely pretty minimal, that I don't think it's inevitable that U.S. support for the Afghan mission continues to deteriorate, even if, as is likely, there's an increase in U.S. casualties.
Yeah, the one thing I would disagree with, and I think this is important, is the question about U.S. public support for the war in Iraq post-surge. I know that there is this pretty well-established logic that the public will support success, and when they see something as successful, they're more likely to support it. But I think, in fact, the evidence from the surge shows exactly the opposite. You had declining support for the war in Iraq, and the way we frame this is not, are you in support of the mission, but do you think the mission is worth it? Do you think that the war in Iraq was worth it? And the tip-over point for that happened before the surge. So more than 50% when they were polled said, was this worth it? And the answer is no. What is striking is after the surge, after the ethnocentarian conflict had died down and kind of petered out, and the combination of the Anbar awakening and the additional troops in Baghdad, etc., and U.S. casualties were way down, and even violence in Iraq were way down. What's striking to me is that the question, was it worth it, did not change, not substantially. And in fact, even after we started to show some success measured just in terms of casualties, the American public had not changed their mind that, in fact, because we were succeeding, again, as measured by limited casualties, they did not believe it was worth it. And that's because costs accumulate. They never go down, and so the costs of staying and of staying in greater numbers only continue to accumulate. And I do think the question, is it worth it or not, is the essential question that we should ask, not just in these two conflicts, but in any conflict. When we engage in a war of choice, which most American wars are wars of choice, that really is the ultimate question.
But I agree. But I'm not necessarily sure I quite see the relevance of the point you're making. I was under the impression that when people who are against McChrystal's, against a surge in Afghanistan, or maybe even in favor of starting to withdraw from Afghanistan, point to public opinion. The reason they're pointing to public opinion is to say, look, guys, even if I thought this was a good idea, even if I were willing to say that we could have some success here, if we were willing to put in the money and lives in the next 5 or 10 or how many years, the American people are going to pull the plug sooner or later, and so why go down a road where we're going to have to get off of? And it seems to me, even if you're right, that Americans are not wildly more supportive of the policies in Iraq. The truth is, we do not have a political climate today in the United States in which Americans are clamoring for us to dramatically move. We are on a glide path down in Iraq, but I don't think if we were to, for instance, if that glide path were to be less steep than it is, I don't think that you don't get the sense in Washington in these elections, which we just were held last week, or in Poland, the American people are demanding that, and that's why I think, look, foreign policy is generally a pretty elite-driven business. There are certain moments in which the public stands up en masse and says no more, for better, usually for better, sometimes for worse. And so I think that there's quite a likelihood that in fact you could go quite a long time in Afghanistan before you reach that point. Now, that's not to say that this is the right strategy. It's only to say that it seems to me, I feel like to some degree people kind of hide behind public opinion when they're saying the American people won't stand for this, when in fact it's they themselves who believe this is a bad idea.
Right. Let me be very clear. I'm not arguing that we cannot sustain this strategy over time because the public won't support it. That's not true. We've sustained unpopular strategies for far longer. My argument is the American people have basically got the cost-benefit analysis right. They've done the rough calculation in their head, and that they are correct in assessing that the cost of staying are not worth the benefits we would derive from it.
Yeah. Well, I think, it seems to me really it comes a lot down to a couple of questions. First of all, how serious do you think the terrorist threat is in general right now?
Right.
Are we living in a world in which Al-Qaeda could pull off another 9/11? Are we living in a world in which Al-Qaeda could pull off 9/11 plus? Or are we living in a world in which Al-Qaeda could only pull off 9/11 minus, particularly in the United States? And I guess I am, even though these plots keep even though we learn of new plots, I guess I am convinced that probably we're in a world of 9/11 minus. We weren't paying attention before 9/11, so it just seems to me logical that these guys can't do all the things they could do when we weren't paying any attention.
Right.
I guess where I'm a little bit less sanguine is about what would happen if we were basically to kind of to basically cede the ground in a lot of Afghanistan. Because it doesn't seem to me that plausible to believe that if we withdraw U.S. troop presence, that a training mission alone in Afghanistan is going to produce very much. I mean, a training mission in Afghanistan, even under the best circumstances, is extremely difficult for all kinds of reasons. The idea that, and it seems to me, it has a lot to do with whether people believe that they could be on the winning side. If the evidence is mounting that they are going to be, that being in an Afghan military is a quick route to basically getting yourself killed and your family killed in a country where Taliban have more and more power, particularly if you're Pashtun and you would need an ethnically mixed Afghan army. That seems to me a proposition of very unlikely to succeed.
Right.
And so I guess I do kind of take the assumption that although it is unpredictable what would happen, that if we were to cede the ground, that you would have the Taliban. Seems most likely, if not, taking probably taking the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan and essentially taking Kandahar, and then you have a pretty wide swath of territory, from basically the entire Pashtun region, in which it seems to me that Al Qaeda, given that this is the area of the world that they have shown that they have used to greatest effect. I mean, I don't think they could work as effectively in Somalia or Yemen
Al-Qaeda,
as they do.
Saying,
yeah, because they have a long history, as Peter Bergen has made this point in his recent New Republics, they have a long history of working with the Pashtun tribes in this area. They know the area. They developed some pretty deep relationships, it seems. I mean, the Taliban didn't hand them over after 9/11, and they haven't handed them over during the Afghanistan fight, even though that would be the easiest way of getting us to leave, presumably.
Right.
Would say, here's Zawahiri and bin Laden, leave.
Right.
And so it seems to me that I worry at that case that we could get back to a kind of we would move from a 9/11 minus world to a world in which bigger kind of terrorist attacks became more possible.
Right. Well, you're right that the crux of this entire debate is on how where we put the danger of terrorism on the continuum of world-altering events to horrible tragedies.
Yeah.
And we're recording this as there was a horrible tragedy, a shooting on in Fort Hood, 13 people dead, and these kinds of tragedies occur from time to time, and most of them, of course, are not terrorism. And I think that's where we start. Is we say, look. I'm not even as sanguine as you, perhaps, and maybe you're not, is that we are not going to get to a world where a 9/11 style event, that is that scale of casualty, is it's certainly not impossible. Okay, that we have to rule off the table. That is not going to happen. But that it is possible over some period of time. You define what your time frame is, 5 or 10 years or every 15 years, whatever it is, right? What are you prepared to do to limit the likelihood of that playing out? Well, you've already alluded that we're paying attention.
Yeah.
Okay, we're paying attention in a way that makes it more difficult for Al-Qaeda. Even if Al-Qaeda was as it was constituted in 9/11, we've made it more difficult for them to carry out another attack because we're all paying attention. And my favorite example of that is United Flight 93, where within a few minutes, frankly, of the first attack, people were paying attention and they took matters into their own hands. We also saw that, of course, a few weeks later when Richard Reed tried to blow up his shoe and was taken. So we are all citizens, not just the government, are paying more attention to this. So I take it from that position. I then move. I think Mark Sageman is closer to being right here. We're not so concerned about Al-Qaeda as a central organization. Clearly, there is still Al-Qaeda central, but it's a very small organization, and it has been disrupted, and its ability to operate from a safe haven has been made far more difficult. But the greater concern is of disconnected leaderless jihad, people who are drawing inspiration through internet chat rooms and whatnot, and carrying out attacks on their own. What does that mean? It means the attacks are likely to be smaller scale. They are likely to fail much of the time, but not all of the time, and that is a different kind of problem, a problem worth worrying about, but it's still not a 9/11 style event. But even having said all that, I am not willing to say that a 9/11 style event is impossible by any stretch, and I think that the measures that we have taken since 9/11 to mitigate that worst kind of scenario, or of course the worst scenario of all, is the confluence of nuclear weapons, some variation thereof. I mean, clearly that's where I think the focus should be on preventing that worst of the worst, and I think that is where a good amount of U.S. effort has been directed and will continue to be directed.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, when you acknowledge that, there could be a 9/11 plus event that could happen. There could be a terrorist event that had nothing to do with Al Qaeda. I mean,
right.
Our minds need to, you could have an Oklahoma City bombing plus.
Right.
I guess on the question of whether, I think you're right that if the question is simply guys, in their basement and on the internet trying to do something, that it doesn't seem like that's likely to produce something on the scale of 9/11. Yet it does seem to me striking, again, and there are people far more experts than me, that a lot of the plots that we're learning about actually are not simply that. They are people who've gone and gotten training in Pakistan from Al Qaeda Central, and I'd say that seems to me that does enhance people's ability to do larger kind of things, and partly it has to do also with one's. I think one has to acknowledge that the cost to the United States of a terrorist attack is largely psychological. I mean, it's not only psychological, of course, but it's significantly psychological, such that there are. And we only have a certain ability. We only have a limited ability to control the kind of reaction that's almost inevitably going to happen. So that it might be that you could have a terrorist attack in the United States that was of relatively small magnitude compared to 9/11, and the consequences for the United States could still be pretty bad. I mean,
because of the reaction, because of how we react to the attack. Right.
And you and I might scream our lungs out saying, let's not respond by clamping down on civil liberties. Let's not respond. Let's keep our heads here. Let's not respond by shutting down commerce and transportation and computer networks, all these kind of things. And yet, even a Barack Obama might try to say that. And yet, it seems to me that there might not be the ability to do that. And so that seems to me, and it may be precisely because and it might be in fact the very same number of people dying in a terrorist attack that came from kids shooting up their school at Columbine has much less of a psychological impact for various reasons than another Al Qaeda attack would, and that's why it seems to me that I worry about whether even a relatively smaller attack than 9/11 would have only modest implications for the U.S.
I also worry about that, which is why, just by coincidence, Cato is in the middle of a 3-year project to talk about counterterrorism as a strategy and thinking strategically, and one of the things that you need to take into account is how the society reacts, what the government does under the guise of fighting terrorism. Can those responses be directed? How can they be directed? And I think we've done a lot of good work on this. We're going to publish a book on it mid part of next year, and that's one of the areas where we've really focused. It's about communication strategy. It's about rhetoric. It's about planning. All of those things can be done. But I think you and I agree that the greatest risk of terrorism is the way in which you react to it.
Accepting some kind of nuclear terrorism.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think that's why I like to go back to, among the few things that I think are worth quoting from Osama bin Laden, he did famously say that his strategy was to bleed and bankrupt the United States. Well, I don't think he'll really be able to do either, but, it is true that we have done some things to ourselves over the last 8 years that, in retrospect, I think most people agree probably weren't wise.
Yes, that's true. Although, it's funny, one of the things you often hear about U.S. foreign policy is that by focusing so much on the Middle East, we've taken our eye off East Asia, where our great strategic competitor is emerging. And yet, I find myself.
Which one is that again? Who would that be?
I find I often feel like actually that I feel like I think the Bush administration's policy towards China and East Asia in general might have been a lot worse had they been paying more attention. That actually, I mean, in a strange way, had we not been diverted to the Middle East, what we might have gotten over the last years was basically a whole segment, a part of the administration and its supporters basically really pushing for a new Cold War with China, which was the way some people were doing on the eve of 9/11. And so in some ways, the kind of the benign neglect we've had towards China and East Asia hasn't served us that badly. That's not an argument for launching wars that don't have a purpose, but it just seems to me, and I sometimes, when people say we need to divert our attention to another part of the world, I'm not always necessarily sure that diversion of attention would actually end up working out that well.
Right, exactly. No, I completely agree. And, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but 100 years from now, some conspiracy theorist will posit that this was all part of some master Chinese plan to get us bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan and countless other places while they, figuratively speaking, ate our lunch. So. Yeah.
No, that's true. Well, maybe on that note, we should end the conversation.
No, that would be great. I appreciate this. This was a good chat, Peter. And
terrific.
Hopefully we can do it again.
Terrific. That'd be great.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye.